Become one of my standard Mother's Day readings. I think I do it almost every year because it is just so perfect. Billy Collins, The Lanyard. The other day I was ricocheting slowly off the blue walls of this room, moving as if underwater from typewriter to piano, from bookshelf to an envelope lying on the floor, when I found myself in the L section of the dictionary, where my eyes fell upon the word lanyard. No cookie nibbled by a French novelist could send one into the past more suddenly, a past where I sat at a workbench at a camp by a deep Adirondack lake, learning how to braid long, thin plastic strips into a lanyard, a gift from my mother. I had never seen anyone use a lanyard or wear one, if that's what you did with them, but that did not keep me from crossing strand over strand again and again until I had made a boxy red and white lanyard for my mother. She gave me life and milk from her breasts, and I gave her a lanyard. She nursed me in many a sick room, lifted spoons of medicine to my lips, laid cold face cloths on my forehead, and then led me out into the airy light and taught me to walk and swim, and I, in turn, presented her with a lanyard. Here are thousands of meals, she said, and here is clothing and a good education, and here is your lanyard, I replied, which I made with a little help from a counselor. Here is a breathing body and a beating heart, strong legs, bones, and teeth, and two clear eyes to read the world, she whispered. And here, I said, is the lanyard I made at camp. And here, I wish to say to her now, is a smaller gift. Not the worn truth that you can never repay your mother, but the rueful admission that when she took the two-tone lanyard from my hand, I was as sure as a boy could be that this useless, worthless thing I wove out of boredom would be enough to make us even. My mother, myself. As a young child, I had severe asthma. One of my earliest memories is of a scary dream I had. I was 4 years old when our family moved into our new house, and the dream must have been sometime after that because it takes place in that house. In the dream, I am in the kitchen of that house, but though it is daylight, the kitchen is dark. My little sister Courtney is with me, and there's something in the shadows of the room that we can't see, but which is very scary. I open my mouth to scream, and nothing comes out. Suddenly I'm awake and aware that I can't breathe. My mother hears me thrashing and comes in and holds me upright and pats me on the back to clear my airway. And when I stop crying, she rocks me until I can go back to sleep. Unconditional love. That's what my actual mother, Elizabeth Courtney Hayward Robinson Boykin Clarkson, known to all of her friends and relatives as Bessie, reminds me of this Mother's Day. The kind of unconditional love that God is said to have for us all. She was there for me, her asthmatic baby, taking me to the hospital a couple of times and setting up a tent on the bed with a vaporizer so that I could breathe steam. Though in the later years we grew apart, separated by geography, politics, and other circumstances, those early years gave me a great grounding in what it was to give and receive unconditional love. Mother's Day is to celebrate motherhood. But I'm aware that motherhood isn't always apple pie. Many of us have had difficult relations with our real mothers. Some of us are adopted or otherwise have more than one person to whom we relate as mother. Some of the women have not been mothers. Others have been mothers, others have not due to choice or circumstance. We like to relate motherhood to the divine, to speak of God as divine father or divine mother, for we seek to understand the holy through analogies, and the unconditional love of a mother or father for the child may be the closest we come to trying to get a dim appreciation of divine love. But I want to say to the Unitarian Universalists, we own this holiday. Historically, there are several strands which come together to establish Mother's Day as a national holiday in America, but one of them was from a well-known Unitarian laywoman, Julia Ward Howe. Though she had written the favorite martial anthem of the Civil War, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, after the war, Howe was appalled at the carnage left in its wake. Her idea was for the women of the South and the women of the North to come together for a great day of council and common mourning, dethrone the culture which glorified war, and resolve that never again would they lift up arms against one another. She organized the Mother's Day for Peace on the second Sunday in May in 1870 and kept it going for several years in Boston. Her proclamation, which I read at the opening of the service, sounds in ringing terms. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. Howe's effort was a creative way to get the power of motherhood mobilized for an end to war. The fact that it didn't avert the violent conflicts, which still occupied the later 19th century and certainly the 20th, does not detract from its nobility. For motherhood is interwoven with human reproduction and is part of the continuance of the human species. And this proclamation of Julia Ward Howe nicely makes the point that the future of humanity hangs in the balance from the scourge of war. Of course, it is also threatened by poverty, by environmental degradation, by patriarchy and racism and ignorance. Who more than mothers to have compassion for the very survival of the species? But the human race is evolving, and motherhood is evolving along with it. Friday, the UU ministers for the Cape and Islands cluster gathered for lunch at a restaurant in Falmouth to meet the candidate for settle minister at the UU Church of Falmouth, a man named David Miller Kohlmeyer. David is a fellow of about 50 who is from West Virginia, and this will be his first settled ministry. The conversation quickly settled on his week and the reception he had gotten from the congregation. He told us that the Falmouth UU congregation was a great group of people, which I already knew, and by way of illustration, he said that he had introduced his husband to them early in the week, but told them that his husband wouldn't necessarily be at all the events on the schedule. He explained that his husband is transgender, and he needs his rest because he is 5 months pregnant. At that point, as he was telling us this, around the table, the ministers all took a little breath. And then he continued, and when the congregation heard this, they gave us both an ovation and hearty congratulations. You've got to be proud of the UUs. Motherhood, like all other features of human society, is evolving. Last week, I asked the question whether science could account for the soul. In the course of discussing this, we had occasion to consider the self, the idea we have of ourselves as individuals. Poet John Donne said, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." If there's one bedrock principle of the religion I try to preach and to practice, it is that we are all interconnected. Our seventh principle reminds us that we are each part of the interdependent web of all existence. And out of the whole human society, in the whole course of our lives, we will be most intimately connected to our parents, our lovers and spouses, and to our own children. So to today's questions, you might ask, have you ever looked in the mirror and seen your mother's or father's eyes looking back at you? Have you ever said something and heard your mother's or father's voice coming out of your own mouth? How do your mother and father get into your looks and your personality? Well, for starters, the self is not a static entity. My conception of who I am today would vary quite a bit from the conception I would have had when I was 20 or 30 or 40. And I will bet you it would be true for you too. As poet Stanley Kunitz put it in his great summing up poem, The Layers, I have walked through many lives, some of them my own, and I am not who I once was, though some core of being abides, from which I struggle not to stray. In my ministerial training 20 years ago, I studied developmental psychology. Psychologist Robert Kegan worked out an elaborate theory of how our consciousness of self develops in stages over our lifetimes. And at each stage, we're embedded in a medium without being aware of it. It's said that if fish had language, they would not have any word for water because it is the medium in which they move. Keegan says that Americans cultivate a myth of individualism. In fact, the most self-sufficient person is deeply tied into others. He coined a term. Instead of individuals, we should call ourselves embedduals because we are embedded in each other. We start out literally embedded in the womb of our mother, and after birth for the first 2 years, our consciousness is entirely subjective. The baby has no sense of itself or any other actors of the landscape. The first objects which the baby recognizes as separate from itself are its parents. This begins a lifetime journey of differentiating yourself from the medium in which you were formerly embedded. What was subjective at one stage becomes objective in the next. Your progress in life also moves back and forth between two poles, one of solitude and the other of fitting in with groups. You can think of the progression in life as a kind of spiral. Each time you return to one side or the other, you're a little further along in the spiral. When we reach adolescence, we are on the social side. Though we have spent our lives up to that point trying to keep the approval of our parents, in junior high school we become desperate for the approval of our peers. Our parents embarrass us at that point. If we have to go to the mall with them, we will walk 5 steps behind or ahead and hope nobody we know will see us there. Our attempts to differentiate ourselves, to claim an identity of our own, will often take the form of an adolescent rebellion against our parents. It did for me and my siblings. My oldest brother got into constant conflicts with our father when he was in high school, mostly over issues of control and discipline. And the stress on Dad was a factor in his first heart attack at age 42. My rebellion a few years later was quieter and was focused on values. My interpretation of the Christian values preached in their beloved Episcopal churches led me to a gut feeling that the way African Americans were treated in the South was wrong, and I said so. I also opposed the Vietnam War. Yet my father's first cousin was General William Childs Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in that war, and other cousins served multiple tours of duty there. To their credit, my parents did not try to persuade me out of my liberal beliefs or cut me off from their love. They supported me in attending Yale, the epitome of liberal northern elite education. But during my college time, I met 2 other married couples for whom I would gladly have traded my parents. liberals, intellectuals, cool, everything I thought my folks were not. I could be myself with these other people. I wanted to adopt them, or for them to adopt me. I felt that my own parents were corny and embarrassing. I think this is a very common experience in young adulthood. We disregard or devalue the home we came from and the parents who embodied that home as we fly around collecting twigs to make our own nest. We carry the idea that our parents are old-fashioned or hopelessly out of date, and we tell ourselves that whatever they were, we have outgrown. We put all that stuff behind us. And then one day, a few years later, we may find ourselves saying something and realize it's what our father or mother used to say. It isn't just the words. We can hear their voices coming out of our voice. We can see their eyes when we look in the mirror. That's when it hits. You never outgrew them. What you have now, outgrown, is the adolescent rebellion. And what this does is clear the way for a new relationship with your parents. Maybe you can become best friends. Maybe you can be support for each other. Maybe you can work through some of the issues of your earlier relationship. When you first came into existence, you were inside your mother. Now you realize your mother and father are inside of you and will be until you die. Of course, they're not the sum total of you. If they're your biological parents, their genes are collectively the sum total of your genes. But this leaves a lot of room for variation. Your parents are inside you more strongly by nurture than by nature, by how they served as role models, teachers, disciplinarians, inspiration. In my own biography, I did not return to the city of my origin after school, but nested in a city 100 miles away. That was a comfortable distance from which I could be a liberal lawyer, a Unitarian, a folk music junkie, without getting in my parents' hair or them getting in mine. My childhood has been spent in a lovely cocoon spun by my parents. My bouts with asthma taught me that I could count on my mother to be there for me when I was in need. I assumed that everyone loved me as much as my parents did, and I can remember when I was at about age 4, where I was at age 4, when a playground insult hurled at me woke me to the fact that other children were not going to be as nice to me as my own parents. Part of that cocoon of love was the church. I inherited from them a love of church as an institution. They helped found 2 Episcopal churches and 1 Episcopal day school, all of which I attended. Priests and bishops were frequent guests in our house for Sunday dinner. My father in his 30s considered leaving the law to attend seminary, but rejected the idea because he didn't think he could raise his 4 children on what a minister makes. After his 1965 stroke disabled him from the practice of law, he became a kind of lay pastoral minister, spending his days visiting at the hospital with random patients. 30 years later, 20 years after his death, I left the practice of law and entered seminary, carrying his dream to fruition. In 1999, my ministry studies concluded. I arranged to be ordained in the Unitarian Church of Charleston the same weekend that I helped my mother celebrate her 80th birthday. And my entry into the Unitarian ministry was blessed by the participation of my mother's favorite Episcopal priest from the 1960s. Though I had jumped denominations, though I had done it in my way, I had moved forward to realize a dream embedded in me by my parents. What I'm trying to express here is that our parents stay with us, and we shouldn't be surprised to see them staring back at us out of the mirror, speaking out of our mouths, or guiding our decisions, big and small. It's evolution, not revolution. Our lives don't repeat our parents' lives, but there are some interwoven features. My parents have handed down to me some of what their parents handed down to them, and I have handed down to my children something of what I got from my parents. Can you see yourselves in your children and grandchildren? Not just in their bodies and faces, but in the way they talk, the way they think, their temperaments, and the choices they make in life? So I see life this morning as offering us a weird kind of immortality. Our ancestors sort of live on in us, and we sort of live on in our descendants. Maybe this is why in traditional cultures you can't do anything without the permission of the ancestors. And I don't think that any of this was foreordained. When my mother died 8 years ago, I ended up with her old photo albums. And there's one photo I like to contemplate. In the olden days in South Carolina, there were things called house parties, where adults would gather at someone's house for a weekend. This photo is from a house party in 1939, the weekend my mother met my dad. And here's this photo of the handsome young law student leaning against the side of someone's car, black of course, with two gorgeous women, one on either side of him. One was my mother, Bessie, and the other was her best friend at the time, Harriet Perkins. Both were unmarried at the time, and I don't know whether Harriet was seeing anyone at that weekend, but suppose each was equally a possibility for the attraction of my father's romantic interest. If at the time that photo was taken, he had fallen for the woman on his right instead of the woman on his left, I would not be here today talking to you. I know Harriet Perkins' children. One of them later dated my sister and attended the same college a year behind me. I would be some combination of them instead of the person I am. We are not islands. We are interconnected, but that does not mean we are interchangeable. We are each the particular people we are because of the particular people who came before us and their particular histories. Those particular people live in us as we lived in them, and as parts of us will live on in those who come after. Generation unto generation. Mother's Day reminds us that whether or not we ourselves have born or begotten children, we are all involved as weavers of personal history, as bearers of love down through the generations. The stuff that ourselves are made of consists in what our parents were made of, as well as everything that has happened to us along the route of this fascinating journey we call our life. Amen.